you with your cohorts, and you're marching through a very dark forest. You've been wanting to go home for a long time. You've been on several campaigns, and it's about time. You're tired. You want to go back to your farm in Italy. And this is the last campaign. As you're marching through the forest, you're about in the middle, and you hear the armor and the sandals hitting the ground. It's soft. You look around. The trees are thick. It's like the tree's been alive for thousands of years. They're so thick they don't let the sunlight come in. And just barely, once in a while, see a ray of sunlight come in. But not much. It's been pretty quiet on this march. You hear the men grumbling in front of you as you march in front of them. And you're in the middle cohort of the 2nd century. And as you're marching, all of a sudden the line comes to a halt. And there's rumors from the front and from the rear that there's an attack going on. And as you look around, you're walled in by these trees on this small path. And for a Roman soldier, this isn't the area you want to be in when you're going to be in battle. The fighting comes closer, the screaming and yelling comes closer. Out of the woods come warriors charging down the hills through the trees, screaming, waving axes, shields, and swords. Arrows fly through the air. Men are dropping around you. You pull out your gladius and you start fighting. There's blood, there's gore, there's men tripping, falling, there's fighting, there's grappling. Somewhere along the line your helmet gets knocked off and you become unconscious. You get hit in the head and you lose it. When you wake up, there's only a few of you left. You still hear screaming and yelling. And the troops that are survived with you, you pull out of the line because you know that it's going to be, you can't handle it. You're not going to be able to survive. So you back out. You're bloodied, you're bruised. Warriors are coming down the hill. You're battling the remnants of them, but they seem going after a bigger prize. What that is, you can only guess. So you grab about 20 to 30 legionnaires and you go off into the woods. And as you go off into the woods, you run into a fog, and the fog just surrounds you. It's thick, which it's almost a blessing because you can't see out and nobody can see in. So you pull your troops close to you and you march through this fog. And as the fog lifts, you see not the thick forest full of warriors anymore, but an open glade. And in that glade, you see a rider. And a rider approaches you. The rider has a lance. You notice that the rider seems slim in build. Pretty fleet on the horse. And you notice there's something funny about the horse. You never particularly cared about legends and mythology as far as unicorns and stuff, but all of a sudden you notice that there's a horn on the head of this horse. And then you distinctly see that the rider is feminine in stature. Long flowing blonde hair. Slanted eyes. A much paler pigment than what you're used to. The woman looks at you and she's got very slim features. Very thin, almost equine. She holds up a bow at you, and you hold your hand and you say hold, and she tilts her head, not recognizing the Latin that you're using. She speaks in a garbled voice that you have no idea what she's saying. She lowers her hand, and as she lowers her hand gently, you start to notice all around you you're surrounded. And you're surrounded by these warriors. They're not female, but they're male, but they have feminine features. But they all have swords at their sides, and they have bows. And they have you completely surrounded. What do you do? Well, guys, that's intro to Dungeons and Dragons. When I was growing up, I loved miniature wargaming, and I always wanted to be a Roman soldier. And basically, I loved everything Saturday morning that had to do with Hercules, the Greeks, Ulysses, Rome, and my first introduction to Dungeons and Dragons was when I was in the Marine Corps. Because we used to drink on the weekends, and during paydays, we got paid every 2 weeks. So that 1 week that we didn't have any money, we would play Dungeons and Dragons. I was introduced to it, and I became a dungeon master. And I've been out of it for a very, very long time. And it takes skill to get somebody, interested into fantasy and make-believe and adventures and that kind of thing. Back in the day, the first book that I grew up with was these right here. That's the first one. That was my first Dungeon Master book. And this is 1979 by Gary Gygax. And this book was well used. And it's just a trip through fantasy. So you had the first edition of Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. You had Dungeons and Dragons. Dungeons and Dragons and Advanced Dungeons and Dragons were two break-offs. They were separate from each other until very recently when they came out and they actually put together the Dungeons and Dragons Advanced and Dungeons and Dragons into what they call the D20 system. Now the D20 system, you have the open games now, where you get Pathfinder, you get EverQuest, such as this here. Then they came out, Games Workshop, Fantasy Role-Playing came out with the same thing. So you had a multitude of different gaming material that came out. This is the Pathfinder, this is the basic set. Just to get an idea what it's about $35 for that. Then you have your Dungeons and Dragons 3.5, and of course they have 4, and now they have the 5th edition that's come out. White Dwarf was also a role-playing aid. It was back in the day before Games Workshop became the money grab that they became. So White Dwarf, basically, they had everything in here. They had role-playing, they had 40K, they had Warhammer Fantasy, and they were a pretty good magazine. And these were the older ones. And then basically they get into 40K a little bit later. Then you had Dragon. The Dragon supplements all dealt with Dungeons and Dragons. You have a little bit of 40K in here, but not much. But you would find stuff in here, a lot of advertisements and stuff like that. But this would be one of your main sources for rules and different characters and different tricks and traps and gadgets and cantrips and spells and potions and wands and magical items, swords and shields. And then you also had Dungeon, which is buried in my comic book stuff. Dungeon basically created dungeons for you. They created scenarios much like these right here. Forgotten Realms, World of Greyhawk. They would actually have ready-made scenarios for you that you could just bring your characters through. So you could either make up your own world, or you could use a world that was already made for you. Now usually these came out like this is Dragon. Dragon put together several of these things for you. So What I noticed was that very recently, I mean, I'm used to these. I'm used to the old lead figures like this for Dungeons and Dragons, and they improved, you know. But I mean, this is what I had. A lot of them are gone now. But a lot of these that you see out here, like bones, and these are pretty neat. These are really neat figures that these companies are producing now, which I didn't have at the time. And this is what Heroescape. That's what they're from. Those Romans are from Heroescape as well. And I was putting together a scenario for them. And it was basically fantasy wargaming and Dungeons & Dragons, but I haven't done anything as far as Dungeons & Dragons goes in a very long time. It's about sword wielding, shields, and all that other neat stuff. I've basically been looking at Critical Role on YouTube, which is pretty cool, and trying to get back into the flavor of things. And it's too bad because I sold a lot of my Dungeons and Dragons figures that I painted. A lot of them are gone. My demons, my skeleton armies, my 5 riders. So a lot of them are history. I don't see too many of them now. But it's definitely a nifty hobby to get into. Oops. And I started out in this service, being a dungeon master, and we would jump on motorcycles and head over to my buddy's house, and we would play these games. And much like Lord of the Rings, I had 5 what I call the Dark Riders, and there were 5 wraiths who, much like Lord of the Rings, they were kind of like witch kings, but they wanted to rule that world, or that continent, or whatever you want to call it, that fantasy world that I created. And my players, they started out first level, they went through different dungeons, and they would gradually learn who was ordering the minions around, and they never quite made it to fight the Dark Riders. I mean, they tried once, but then they backed out because they were just too difficult. And they got up to about 8 or 9 as far as levels go. And these magic users, fighters, whatever you want to call them, these Dark Riders, were just too intense. That's not to say they didn't have fun. They did. We had a ball. I loved it. To me, Dungeons and Dragons was an escape. In the Marine Corps, after going out for a week and getting bombed and stuff, if we weren't on maneuvers, if we weren't out in the field, we'd come home. We'd be at barracks, and barracks are pretty quiet and boring. So, we get paid twice a month. So we get 1 week. So there was 2 times in that week. So there was 1 week where we wouldn't have any money at all. So we played Dungeons and Dragons, and setting up. It would take me at least 3 or 4 days just to set up a scenario for my friends to play through. and it caught on, and it was pretty cool. I miss it. I don't have the time that I used to. I still got a lot of books. A lot of books were given to me. I just ordered from Amazon. I just ordered the 5th edition to see what it's all about now. But basically, that's all I got left as far as my figures go for Dungeons and Dragons, and my books and stuff for Dungeons and Dragons. I have a lot of dragons. I have a lot of the magazine dragons, and I have a lot of White Dwarf magazines. Store down the street has some dungeons, which I might pick up just to get an idea, see what's going on. I just picked up the Pathfinder to see what that's about. I've had EverQuest because I actually kind of dig the chick in EverQuest. This looks really hot, this one here. So I ended up picking that up just because this girl's sweet. I love this. So there's several areas that you can actually kind of adventure into, and that would be your EverQuest role-playing, your Pathfinder over there, which is very similar to Dungeons & Dragons. And now they have what I know Games Workshop has the role-playing for what is it? Dark Heresy, I believe. Rogue Trader, right here. There's a core rule book for playing in the Games Workshop world of things. I forgot I even had this, which I guess is pretty cool. Fantasy Flight Games. I don't even know. You know what? I have it.